Well, hello, good evening. Hi, everybody. It's Monday night, so that must be yet another talk from my loyal listeners or loyal watchers. This evening, I wanted to start just by talking about something which is very much in the news for all of us at the moment, especially those who are wanting to get back to some live music making and some live singing. And that is the topic of the mask. This particular item is one which I've recently acquired. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about this. And also I wanted to tell you a little bit about how it works and the whole business, the whole process of wearing masks whilst performing or whilst singing in particular. It's something that a lot of us are getting used to. I'm having to teach wearing a mask. All my students have masks on during the whole lesson, and that's a 2.5 hour session on a stretch. So it's quite a major thing. And also my players, apart from the wind players, obviously, they have to wear masks, and so do the singers. So I wanted just to talk a little bit about it and hopefully try and put some of your minds at rest from the experience that I've had and am having, which will hopefully help a little bit. This particular mask, as I say, was made specially for me by a delightful person living in the next village. But it's based on a design which is readily available from a lady called Joan. And if you were to go Soprano Joan or put in Soprano Joan into the internet, into a well-known search engine, you will come across Soprano Joan and her specific designs that she's spent a lot of time developing, a design of a mask which is suitable for people to use for singing. As a professional singer herself, obviously, it's something that she understands very well. She doesn't actually produce them, but she does issue, I think, free the patterns and all the specifications so people can make them for themselves or commission some good seamstress to make them for you. And I'll just go through some of the elements of this. As you can see, I mean, this one's an interesting sort of design. You can use any material, obviously, so take no notice of the outside. But inside, you may be able to see that there are two really quite substantial seams in here. And although it's been beautifully crafted and beautifully sewn, hiding inside these seams are cable ties. Bits of plastic, basically, and they are very specific to the design because they maintain a space at all times between the wearer, the person's face, and the front of the mask, thus allowing there to be quite a lot of space inside the mask, which allows freedom of air, freedom of movement. You can move your chin up and down without the mask changing. As you sing or speak, you won't find the kind of bellow effect that is so off-putting when you see people talking on news bulletins. So it's a really clever design. It's also, I should say, I should be a salesperson. It's also got a filter in here. So between the various layers of material, there is a very efficient filter which is preventing any amount of aerosol or droplets escaping from the front of the mask at any rate. And you can also wash it at temperatures up to 60 degrees. So every day or however often you want to, you can wash it and reuse it almost an unlimited amount of time. And if I just put it on briefly, you'll see that the one thing about it, you'll hear that my voice has changed a little bit. You'd expect that. But from within, although I can hear that my voice has changed, the actual process of speaking or la, 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 or singing is absolutely effortless. It's really easy because you've got this large space in front of you where there is no touching between the mask and the face, and your jaw is completely free to move around. You can do almost anything you like, and it has no effect. And the other thing that's really good about it is that because of the very subtle fitting, you don't have that feeling of big gaps at the side where everything's gushing out sideways. So it really is very good. And people, I haven't done this myself, but I know people who've tested it, not in a very scientific way, but they've actually placed a candle very, very close to the front of their face and tried to blow the flame of the candle to make the flame flicker. And they've been unable to do it, even with that close. So blowing as hard as they could through the mask, the flame stayed absolutely still, no flicker at all. So I think in terms of safety, it's certainly the best mask I've ever come across that's obviously not of hospital type. And as it has been specifically designed for singing and by singers, it works really well. And I know other people who've tried it find it's absolutely fine. And certainly when I'm teaching or when I'm working with my Ockham singers, I wear a mask like this for the whole duration of the rehearsal, and I don't even notice it. After a few minutes, you just forget about it completely and you just carry on as normal. Everybody looks a bit strange, but in terms of the actual process of singing, it's absolutely fine. So I would heartily recommend both this or something similar to this as a design, but also reassure you that actually it's not as bad as one might think, having to sing and work and perform wearing a mask like this. So I shall remove it straight away. But just to remind you that the lady who designed it and operates her website, I think it's on YouTube, her website, but if you Google it, you'll find it. Just put in Soprano Joan and you will come across her. You will find her readily enough. So enough about masks. Let's carry on. I wanted to talk today about composers who are dealing with or have dealt with adversity, stress, times of trouble, for obvious reasons. This is something that often crops up in my weird head, that I end up thinking not about contemporary issues, because I try and avoid contemporary issues as far as possible, but issues of the past and how artists and composers and playwrights have adapted and carried on, fought against the adversity of their times. And of course, the list is endless, pretty much, both of those artists and musicians and so on who have had to deal with adversity, but also the amount of adversity there has been in various historical periods and so forth. So in that sense, we are not living through anything which is particularly unlike some of the issues that composers have had to deal with before. But in particular, my mind has been drawn this week, in the last few days, to thinking about Russia and Russian composers of the 20th century. And if one thinks about the big four, as it were, of 20th century Russian composers, the names that immediately spring up are, I would guess, Rachmaninoff, Prokofiev, Stravinsky, and Shostakovich. So those are the kind of big four Russian composers of the early and mid period of the 20th century. And of those, Rachmaninoff died in 1943, Prokofiev died in 1953, Stravinsky lived a long time. He only died in 1971, but by then he was pretty much more of an American than a Russian, having spent the last part of his life in the States. And then Shostakovich died in 1975, which of course is only 45 years ago. And it's Shostakovich in particular that I wanted to talk about tonight, because I felt of those big four composers, he is perhaps the one least known, least understood, and who probably had the hardest time, the toughest artistic life in particular. So I thought it was worth a bit of a visit, just to try and put some of the records straight, as it were. So what can I tell you about Shostakovich? Well, first of all, he was born in 1906, and his father was an engineer, all fairly conventional. He studied at the Conservatoire in Petrograd, as it was then called. Obviously, later it became known as St. Petersburg. What we think of it as St. Petersburg. At that point, it was called Petrograd. And he studied composition and piano, absolutely standard, you would think, and it is indeed. He was obviously a very eminent pianist and a very, very fine exponent of the piano, so much so that he did enter the Chopin piano competition in Warsaw in, I think it was 1927. But although he was highly commended for his technique and his technical playing, I think the judges felt they were probably slightly biased because they were all Polish and he was Russian. But also I think they got the impression, and they even managed to give Shostakovich the impression, that his playing was a little bit too literal, a little bit too precise for Chopin. You know, he was very good at playing the notes, but perhaps didn't have quite the artistry and the feel for Chopin's music that the judges were looking for. And perhaps it's no surprise, therefore, that after that competition in 1927, that Shostakovich no longer performed in public any piano music other than his own. So he was put off playing the established repertoire and only performed his own pieces in public. So from then on, it was composition that was going to be his number one thing. And of course, composition combined with teaching, conservatoire teaching, both in St. Petersburg and in Moscow as well. But as a composer, Shostakovich had quite an impressive early start. As young as 19, he produced his first symphony, which, but this time with 1925, it was really successful and much adored by the Russian public, and more particularly by the Russian authorities. And in the 1920s, middle of the 1920s, Russian culture was still comparatively free. In other words, they were free to embrace all the different styles of music that were going on within Europe, and there was very little pressure on composers. But of course, that was to change drastically. And one of the things that happened to Shostakovich, as I'm sure many of you know, is that he wrote 2 operas that he completed. He wrote several more, which are incomplete, but of the 2 operas that were completed, Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk District is the one that everybody has heard of, and is by far the most successful. But, and this was the difficulty, that although he wrote it in 1932 and it had quite a lot of initial success, in 1936, just 4 years later, Stalin actually came to a performance to find out for himself about this piece. And Stalin was not impressed, to put it mildly. He laughed at times. He was exceptionally rude about it as a piece. It was bourgeois. It was not a fitting work for the great Russian public. And pretty much from that moment, from 1936 onwards, the music and musicians in Russia were subject to the most extraordinary amount of state intervention and control. And sometimes this amount of intervention and control could be absolutely ruthless. So much so that many of Shostakovich's friends and colleagues ended up being sent to Siberia. Some of them were never heard of again. Some were just straightforward locked up, imprisoned, just for writing a piece of music or writing in a style which Stalin and his cronies felt wasn't appropriate. So these were really, really tough times for any musician and for any composer. And it's no surprise, therefore, that Shostakovich wrote his famous response to all this criticism from the authorities in Soviet Russia. And that was, we become known as the Fifth Symphony, a Soviet artist's reply to just criticism, he called it. So in other words, he was actually admitting that there was a necessity for him to kind of apologize for some of this outrageous bourgeois avant-garde music that he'd been producing. And he wrote this symphony very much as an appeasement to the authorities and to Stalin, to say, here is a piece, I can write music that you're going to enjoy. I'm going to write something which is much more traditional, much more conventional in many ways, and nowhere near as avant-garde. This happened to coincide with Shostakovich's interest in Mahler and the symphonies of Mahler. And also, I personally hear a lot of Beethoven, in particularly this Fifth Symphony. It's in D minor for a start, which of course is the same key as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the choral symphony. And although it doesn't have a chorus, it has a similar kind of setup, with the scherzo coming second, the slow movement third, and the finale is a real celebration of everything that you can imagine, and lots of real gregarious, outward-going, very, very approachable music that sums up the finale of the Fifth Symphony. And whilst it's been derided for the circumstances in which he wrote it, and some people have different views about the quality of the music from a sort of refined viewpoint, my feeling is, and I know most people who listen to Shostakovich and the Fifth Symphony in particular absolutely adore it. It's a wonderful piece, wonderfully approachable and truly celebratory. So you would think that this would enable the composer to continue to work and to carry on as a composer working in Soviet Russia, as it were, not being molested all the time by the authorities. Alas, that was not the case. And shortly after, from 1936 onwards, basically the Soviet authorities banned anything at all that was connected with the slightest hint of the avant-garde or anything to do with jazz or anything that was new in any way. And it got to the point where Shostakovich was terrified of producing new pieces and actually had to withdraw. He had to withdraw his Lady Macbeth opera. He withdrew other symphonies, and really life became very, very tough indeed. One of the results of this is that he ended up going back to, as it's now called, Leningrad, and started to teach in the conservatoire, to teach composition. Great thing to do, and one of the things that he is renowned for as a teacher. But even that had its stress and its strain, because he was there during the Second World War. He was in Leningrad when the great siege of Leningrad took place, when the German army, the Nazis, were surrounding the city for all that time, trying to starve the city to death. And it was during that time that Shostakovich wrote his famous Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad, or at least he started. He didn't quite complete it while he was there, but he started it. The early movements were all written whilst he was under siege with his family, but nevertheless under siege in the city of Leningrad, surrounded by the German army. And although the piece was eventually completed when he escaped, or had moved out of Leningrad, and the first performance of the piece took place elsewhere, there is a very famous account of the symphony being performed in Leningrad while still under siege. And the only way they could do it was to put it through the PA system, through loudspeakers, and broadcast it to the inhabitants in that way, which reminded me very much of the kind of streaming idea that we're living through now, where you can't get people together into a concert hall. You have to take the music out through some sort of electronic means. And this is perhaps the first example of that happening. So really interesting. And the other thing about that is that at the time, the orchestra that were left in Leningrad only had 14 members remaining. Others had either died or moved out or escaped or whatever. So to perform a complete symphony with 14 musicians, not really possible. So what they had to do was scour the city for almost anybody who could hold an instrument, who could play the violin or the cello or whatever, and they hauled them in. So whether they were professional musicians or amateur, they were hauled in to produce the orchestra, which enabled them to perform this new symphony for the people of Leningrad, who were still at that time under siege. In spite of 2 visits to the United States, he visited in 1949 and in 1958, and Shostakovich also had a number of tours to Europe, including to the United Kingdom and Germany and France and so on. But he remained a Soviet citizen, unlike Stravinsky, who moved to the States. He remained basically in Russia, but had a torrid time of it. Eventually, he was thrown out of all his teaching posts. He was just told to get out. He was constantly being attacked and disgraced. Even some of the great musicians of his time were very unsupportive of him, both as a musician and also as a composer. Some people absolutely adored his music, others were much more critical. So life was really quite tough for him, and he must have had really quite a difficult time trying to make a living, trying to keep working under this constant stream of attack and criticism, and basically trying to keep his nose clean and trying to keep under the radar so that he wasn't cast out into outer Siberia or worse, which is what happened to so many of his colleagues. By all accounts, Shostakovich was quite a difficult personality in some ways. And perhaps not difficult, that's not quite the right word, but he didn't come across as having a huge amount of charm. When you look at his photographs, you often see quite a stern face, very serious, and yet that wasn't the story at all, although he was very pernickety in some ways. I read an account of him being obsessed with clocks and making sure that every single clock in his house or his home was exactly at the right time, and that they all combined at exactly the right moment. So they all chimed, or whatever they did, exactly on time and together rather than separately. He also had I love this, he also had a fascination with the world outside and how efficient it was being run, especially things in Russia. And he took to writing postcards to himself. So he would literally write a postcard, address it to himself, post it, and then time it to see how long it took to be delivered. So it was his way of testing out the efficiency of the postal service at the time. Towards the end of his life, also, he had inevitably, I would guess, quite a lot of physical issues and health issues. He was a heavy smoker, and he was very reluctant to stop smoking. But he also suffered from motor neurone disease, such that he lost any use in his right hand. Perhaps because of the motor neuron disease, he had a number of falls, ending up breaking both legs. So with his dodgy right hand and 2 broken legs, he did remark that he only had one extremity left that was still functioning. That's a fairly depressing thought. And he eventually died, as I say, in 1975 of lung cancer, from which he'd suffered for some time. So it was not an auspicious end, shall we say. But given what he's gone through and what he had been through and the amount of pressure on him, it perhaps no surprise. And those close to him, his wives, plural, and his 2 children, spoke amazingly high of him as a human being, of his warmth, of his exterior image not being accurate at all. And it's interesting, isn't it, that one of the pieces that perhaps he's best known for is the waltz from what's often referred to as the Second Jazz Suite. In fact, the first Jazz Suite was written in the 1930s, before the real pressures of the Soviet system started to take hold. But what we know as the Second Suite was actually written much later, probably in the mid 1950s. So when things were calming down a little bit, and it wasn't originally called the Jazz Suite. It was simply called a suite for variety orchestra. In other words, a kind of theatre orchestra piece. You know the one I mean. So that's become one of his sort of signature tunes, used a lot for film music, dances, ballets. It's used a lot. You hear it all the time, used for adverts. It's become very much his signature piece. And although it's in minor key and it's quite hypnotic, I don't think anybody would call it sad or miserable. And I think that's one of the ways to look at Shostakovich's music, that although he had a really tough time and the pressures on him must have been acute, he nevertheless managed to write some music which is amazingly approachable and often very, very inspiring. If you would like a way in to listen to some of his music, I would certainly recommend listening to the Fifth Symphony perhaps first, in spite of the cynics who say, oh, you know, this isn't real Shostakovich, this is him trying to suck up to the authorities. It nevertheless is a wonderful symphony. You can think of it in the same sort of terms as Mahler or perhaps some of the Rachmaninoff symphonies as well. Although the style is different from Rachmaninoff, the kind of spirit is still there. So I'd certainly recommend that. I would recommend listening to the Leningrad Symphony, which at number 7. Apart from anything else, it's just fascinating to know about the way in which was composed, the way it was conceived, and also that famous performance that was done through the loudspeakers to the people of Leningrad. That would be a good way in. And then if you want more, then I would go to some of the later symphonies. There are 15 in all to choose from. 14 is one that I personally love very much. Number 10 is also a fabulous piece, a little bit more demanding of the listener than the Fifth is. But if you like the Fifth, then have a listen to number 10. I think you'll enjoy that as well. And there's a whole host of other wonderful music that Shostakovich wrote. There are 3 concertos, a violin, piano, and cello concerto. There's film music, there are ballets, there's a whole range of chamber music, and of course there's the piano music. And one of the things that you'll find about Shostakovich is towards the end of his life, he got more and more interested in very strict musical structures, in particular the chaconne. We talked about chaconne last week, or I did. Maybe you did too, I don't know. But we talked about the chaconne last week in the Bach cantata that I was discussing with you, where you have a constantly repeating bass line. So Shostakovich got really interested in the idea of using very, very set pattern of notes, or very, very strict theme. And the other thing, of course, was the fugue, preludes and fugues. So there are loads of piano pieces, which are a bit like the Bach 48 preludes and fugues. But Shostakovich wrote it obviously in a very different style, but the structure is very similar to a conventional Baroque fugue. He also liked to write a version of his of his initials, excuse me, transferred to a melodic line. If you take the note D and then E flat and then C and then H, which as we know is B natural in old German notation, E flat was like an S. So if you think of S spelt out, ES, then it's very similar to E flat. So you get D, Dimitri, E flat, C, H, or B natural, as we think of it. So that was a phrase that he used a lot in some of his later works. And this interest in, as so often composers do this, don't they? As they get towards the end of their life or end of their working life, they tend to look backwards and either discover or rediscover musical forms, musical structures, musical techniques that have been particularly utilized in a past time, such as Mozart did it, writing fugues influenced by Bach. Mendelssohn did it a lot. Brahms did it, looking back at Beethoven and so on. There's always this trend. Well, not I say always, very often there's a trend of composers as they get older, looking back, rediscovering some techniques and some ideas from the past and embracing them and reconstituting those ideas in their music, even though they are very much up to the minute contemporary composers of their time. So I hope that was of some interest to you, and I would certainly recommend that you do investigate some of Shostakovich's works, and I hope that you might find that you enjoy them. And if you haven't listened to much Shostakovich, then hopefully it'll be of interest and a new area for your interest in music generally. And the fact that so much of it is instrumental may not appeal to everybody. I know most of us have a real affinity with vocal music, but it doesn't do any harm just now and again to push the boat out a bit and listen to something which is a little bit less familiar. I'm going to leave you with just the finale of the Fifth Symphony, which is perhaps one of his most famous works, and you'll get a feel for the kind of celebratory nature of this. Just gave you a little flavor there. That was actually Valery Gergiev with the Mariinsky Orchestra. I've never heard it played quite as in such a sprightly way as that. So that shows you something about the full Russian flavor, Russian conductor, Russian orchestra, and how they approach Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. So well worth a try. I won't play anymore because you can do it much better yourselves and hearing it in better quality. But do have a look, listen, do have a look, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye for now.